Well, hello everyone. Welcome to week number 6 for MPA 610. I hope everyone's doing well. Just a couple of quick reminders before we get into our information for this evening. The first reminder is your multimedia assignment that is coming due by midnight on October 6th. I received a couple of them already in our Canvas site, and the ones I've received I've already reviewed and then returned some feedback on. They've been excellent, the ones I've received so far. So far, so good, I guess, as they say. But that is due then by midnight on October 6th. And then you'll have Canvas essay number 6, which is also coming due then for next week. In Canvas essay 6, you will be taking some of the information that we talk about tonight in terms of the development of the public organization theory literature. And you'll be in that discussion highlighting 2 or 3 of the primary trends that you see that really mark this evolution or development of the literature. And what we'll do tonight is we'll go through that evolution of the literature, beginning with the late 1800s and going to our modern contemporary period of time. So once we are done with our information tonight, then you'll have what you need in order to do Canvas essay number 6. Kind of to do a course reset, though, where we are and where we are going. So tonight and next week, the primary topic that we'll cover, leading and managing public organizations. So we'll start to get into some of the discrete functions of public administration. Tonight, we'll talk about it from an organizational perspective. So we'll look at how we manage our public organizations and what the literature tells us about how to study and manage those public organizations. As we had talked about in our first night together, when we defined public administration, we said public administration was essentially the study of bureaucracies, and bureaucracies are public organizations. So I think we can get a really good flavor of the development of the literature in the field by looking at how the literature has changed its focus in terms of how we study and how we manage our public organizations. So that will be the topic for tonight's class. Then when we get together next week for week number 7, we'll continue our discussion of leadership and management and public administration by talking about how we manage 2 of the primary resources we manage on a daily basis. Number 1, how we manage human resources and how we manage fiscal resources. And so that will then be the topic for next week. Then week 8 will be 2 weeks from tonight will be our final Zoom session together. As our final Zoom session, I think we can probably do an abbreviated session. So I kind of envision us maybe going from about 6 to 7:30 or so. And what we'll do is we'll just quickly introduce some of the current and future issues that affect public administration and kind of look at a few of those articles that I've assigned for you for that week, looking at things like work-life balance, looking at things such as remote work arrangements, telework, managing diversity, and just cover some of those very salient current and future issues in the field of public administration. And then that will wrap up our time together. So 2 weeks from tonight's our last session. And then you'll just be wrapping up your final assessment and your final Canvas essay, all that wrapped up then by the end of that week on October 18th. And then you are done with this course. So we are quickly progressing toward the end of our time together. Before we get into what we're going to cover tonight, Anna Maria, I know you had sent me an email that you wanted to make a quick announcement tonight about a Discord link that you had created. So would you like to do that?
Hi, Professor. Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be sending through the general discussion a link to Discord so we can kind of go through the program together so we're not as alienated, I guess. But I'll be sending that out during tonight's class. So just to look out for that.
Perfect. And thank you very much for doing that. I really appreciate that. And I think it's a great idea. It will keep you very well connected in between when you have classes together. And even while you're taking classes, it's still kind of another resource for you to remain connected. And I think that's really an important thing to do. So thank you for doing it, Anna Maria. Really, I think that's a great thing. I appreciate that. And yeah, if you can just post that link in our general discussion forum. And then everyone, when you go into our Canvas site, I know no one's posted that general discussion forum yet. When you go into the Canvas site, there is a link there for general discussion forum, and I think Anna Maria is going to go ahead and post that Discord link in there, and I'll make it available for everyone. So thank you again for that. Okay. Let's go ahead and get into our information for this evening. And if you were an undergraduate public administration major, which I know most people weren't, but some folks may have taken some undergraduate public administration courses, some of the information that we talk about tonight is going to be relatively familiar to you. Because what we're going to do is we're going to do a very quick overview of the development of the literature in public administration, focusing on public organizations. So what we will do is we'll start in the late 1800s, and we'll start with the what we call the classical school. People like Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and Luther Gulick and Henri Fayol. Talk about some of those classical theorists, talk about some of the differences between their theories, but then also some of the linkages that kind of tie all of our classical theorists together. So we're going to kind of take a chronological perspective. So with Max Weber, we'll talk about him as a classical theorist writing in the very late 1800s. Frederick Taylor, a classical theorist writing in the early 1900s. Henri Fayol and Luther Gulick also writing in the early 1900s, oftentimes a little bit behind or a little bit more recently than some of the theories of Frederick Taylor. And we'll present that as what we consider to be our classical school of how we traditionally viewed and studied public organizations. Then we will move into a discussion of what we refer to as the neoclassical schools. And the neoclassical schools are just simply the schools that developed after the classical school. And those schools, such as the schools of human relations theory, human resource management, systems theory, some more modern theories, quality management, organization culture, most of those neoclassical theories and schools of thought really grew up as rejoinders or responses to some of the perceived criticisms and failures of the classical school. And typically, whenever we see a new school of thought emerge, that new school is emerging because of criticisms that have been lodged against the previous school. So they're usually critiques of some of the problems with the previous schools that they are meant to then replace. So we'll do the classical school, then we'll go through some neoclassical schools as well. And when we talk about schools of thought, we're just talking about the generalities that are shared by different theorists. And so we're grouping Weber, Taylor, Gulick, Fayol together in the classical school just because their focus was relatively similar. And so they all kind of fall into that classical approach. People like Mary Parker Follett and Chester Barnard and Elton Mayo, we're going to classify into what we call the human relations school because they all share kind of a similar perspective and so on and so on. So we've got these schools of thought and then theorists who wrote within each one of those schools of thought. And I apologize in advance. My allergies are really kind of a mess today. So I apologize if I start sneezing or anything like that. That's what's going on. It's not COVID, it's just allergies. Trust me. Okay, let's get started with our classical school. And again, you may have run into some of these folks before, but the first classical theorist we usually begin with is Max Weber. And Max Weber is that gentleman at the bottom left of your screen. Max Weber, writing in the late 1800s, focused very much on the structure of organizations. What he wanted to do is he wanted to find for us the one perfect or the one ideal way of structuring a bureaucratic organization. Now, Weber was a big believer in rationality. And when we think about how we make decisions, rationality, the rational comprehensive decision-making model, tells us that we're going to go out there, we're going to collect all the information that is available, we're going to synthesize that information and use that information to then come up with the best answer to a problem, the best solution to a problem. That's a very rational, comprehensive approach. The idea that underpins rational, comprehensive decision making is the assumption that we are going to base our decisions on empirical information. We're going to base our decisions upon information that we can tangibly sense, we can collect, we can analyze. We're not just going to make our decisions based upon what we feel or on our belief system, but rather we're going to make our decisions based upon tangible empirical information. Weber really did believe that the utmost level of rationality was an ideal bureaucratic organization. And he argued if we could structure our organizations in this ideal manner, that's how we can make our organizations effective and efficient. So the ultimate goal for Max Weber was a macro level focus on the organization itself. How can we make our organizations as effective and as efficient as possible? And his answer was by the way in which we structure them. And if we structure them in what he called this ideal bureaucratic structure, that's what will make our organizations effective and efficient. So, in his ideal bureaucracy, he says there are several characteristics of an ideal bureaucratic structure. Things such as a tall hierarchy. A tall hierarchy is that pyramidal shape whereby you have a singular head of the organization. As you move down the organization structure, you encounter more and more positions. That type of pyramidal shape to our structure means that most of the direction, most of the orders are going to come from the top down. So it's a very centralized, very top down type of situation. So he believes that we should structure all of our organizations in this very stringent, very tall hierarchical system. Now, as you look at your organizations that you work in, you probably see this tall hierarchy in many of your organizations. I'm sure you have an organization chart. That organization chart will show you how all the different positions in your organization are directly related to each other. They will show you to whom you are accountable as an employee and which employees are accountable to you. So that's your organization chart, that tall hierarchy. If you work in law enforcement or in fire, you work in a paramilitary organization, you're probably going to see a much stricter, tall hierarchy than you might see in another type of public organization. But all of our organizations typically have this organization chart, some type of this tall hierarchical type of system. Look at a university, you see a tall hierarchical system in a university. You have a president, then you have a provost, then you have vice provosts and vice presidents, and you have deans, and below deans, you have department chairs. Below department chairs, you have program directors, and so on and so on. So it's a very common structure in most of our bureaucracies. In this tall hierarchy, Weber then tells us the second main characteristic is division of labor. We have all these people in the organization. We divide up the work in the organization. Everyone then gets their own position. They get their own tasks that they do on a daily basis. You want a great example of division of labor in an organization? Take a look at the US Congress. As Woodrow Wilson used to say, Congress at work is Congress in committees. Congress breaks itself up into committees. Those committees are broken up into subcommittees. That's division of labor. When we divide up the labor in the organization, it means that individual employees are then specializing in certain types of tasks. They do the same tasks day in and day out. When you're doing the same tasks every single day, you're specializing in those tasks. And as you specialize in those tasks, you then become an expert in those tasks that you are doing. So we have some employees who are budget analysts who specialize in analyzing budgets. We have some employees who are human resource managers. We have some employees who are payroll technicians. We have some employees who are project managers, and so on and so on. So you specialize in these specific tasks and you then become an expert. In your organization, if you're currently working in an organization, you probably have a position description. That position description will tell you which task you specialize in on a daily basis. Your description will probably tell you, here's the one task, here's the percentage of time that you spend daily on that task. Here's task number two, here's a percentage of time that you spend on task number two, and so on and so on. So we still see a lot of these elements of an ideal bureaucracy in our modern day organizations. So we have an organization that fits within this organization structure, staffed by experts. Those people working in that organization are then also subject to a unity of command. There's this what's called a scalar chain, a chain of command. So everyone knows to whom they are accountable as you move down the organization chart. However, we also recognize that people can only do so much. And so we then use what's called a span of control. So when you look at a manager in the organization chart, that manager may be accountable, responsible for maybe a unit or one division within the organization. They're not going to be responsible necessarily for every person in every unit that's below them in the organization chart. They will have a limited span of control. That limited span of control then recognizes that people do have some limitations on their ability to be rational. It's what our good friend Herb Simon in the public administration literature refers to as bounded rationality. We are human beings. As human beings, we have bounded rationality. We have cognitive limitations. There's only so much information we can acquire, only so much information that we can process, only so many people that we can oversee. So we're going to limit manager's span of control. These people, these experts who are specializing in these tasks on a daily basis, they are professionals and they are career employees. So they view their tenure in this organization as a career. They're not going to bounce from one organization to another. They really view their tenure in this organization as being for an entire career. And since we are being rational in our decision making, we need to write down information. We need to base our decisions upon written documentation. So we'll write down our rules and regulations. We'll write down our policies and our procedures. Then those written rules and those written procedures will then guide the way in which we interact with people going forward on a daily basis. There's good and bad, obviously, about written documentation. The good of relying upon written documentation is it means that we will treat people, hopefully, in a fair and equitable manner. That here are the policies, and everyone will have the same policies applied to them, irrespective of who they are, what family they come from, their social standing, doesn't matter. You will then be subject to the same policies and rules that everyone else is subject to. It's a good way for us to protect individual rights and make sure that we're not engaging in arbitrary, capricious, or prejudicial type of treatment of the people we come into contact with. As you know, the downside of written documentation is red tape. As organizations tend to age, they tend to develop more and more policies and rules and regulations. As they develop more policies, rules, and regulations, they then start to engage in what Robert Merton refers to as goal displacement. And goal displacement is when an organization, instead of focusing on serving the citizens it's supposed to serve and providing the outcomes that will meet the wants, needs, and desires of those citizens, instead, the organization will establish its goal as adhering to its policies and its rules. So adherence to rules and policies then becomes more important than meeting the wants, needs, and desires of the people we are meant to try and serve. Their goals become displaced. That's what Merton refers to as a bureaucratic dysfunction. As organizations age, they tend to develop more positions, more rules, more regulations. They become more fragmented, which then leads to this goal displacement. Also, as they tend to develop more red tape, they also tend to become more institutionally rigid. And there's a phenomenon in public administration known as institutional rigidity. As organizations age and develop more rules and regulations, start adhering more stringently to those rules and regulations, they become much more rigid as an institution. They become less able to respond to challenges and changes in their environment. They become less able to respond to the needs of the citizens that they are supposed to be serving. The problem with that, obviously, is when they become institutionally rigid, they create these walls between the organization and members of the public, which then makes it more difficult for members of the public to interact with these organizations. That leads to a lot of frustration among members of the public. That's what leads to a lot of the negative associations that people tend to have with bureaucratic organizations. It also tends to violate one of the principles in the American Society for Public Administration Code of Conduct, in that we are no longer encouraging democratic participation. We are now discouraging people from participating in our organizations and in decision making. But according to Weber, If we can structure our organizations in this ideal bureaucratic structure, exhibiting these different characteristics, that is what will make our organizations effective and efficient. But it's very much this macro level focus on what is in the best interest of the organization. As you can see, he's basically trying to make our organizations as rational as possible because he was a big believer in the importance of rationality in decision making. So that's Max Weber. It's also important for us to note because we had this discussion before about the idea of public administration as an academic discipline. And we had said to be an academic discipline, you need to have some uniqueness. You need to have uniqueness in the phenomena that you are studying. You also need to have uniqueness in the methods and approaches that you are applying to studying those phenomena. Well, Max Weber was not a public administration theorist per se. Max Weber was a German sociologist. A lot of his work applied to organizations writ large, and he really didn't focus squarely on public organizations. So here's an example of a major fundamental theory that underpins the classical school of public organization theory that's coming from outside of what you would think would be the normal field of public administration. So we are again being interdisciplinary and borrowing theories from outside of our field. So that's Max Weber, usually considered to kind of be the bedrock classic organization theorist. And we go ahead and you go in the future and you take an organization theory class, you'll talk a lot more about Max Weber. But our purpose is here with our discussion tonight is just to kind of give you a flavor of how the public organization theory literature has evolved over the past 150 years. Kind of hit that tip of the iceberg since we are an introductory course and kind of whet your appetite then for a future course that you'll be taking in organization theory. Then a second classical theorist that we always talk about in this class is Frederick Taylor, and Frederick Taylor's school or theory of scientific management. So Frederick Taylor is again someone who comes from outside of what we would consider to be the traditional public sector view. Frederick Taylor developed most of his theories for private sector organizations. And then these theories that were developed for the private sector were then taken and applied to the public bureaucracy. Frederick Taylor is best known for his theory of scientific management. So one of the commonalities between Taylor and Weber is they were both interested in what is best for the organization. For Weber, if we can structure it correctly, that will make our organizations effective. For Frederick Taylor, he was most interested in making our organizations as efficient as they can possibly be. So they both kind of shared this macro level view of organizations. The difference is that where Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked at work processes. So he looked at the work that was going on within the organization. And he said, if we could deconstruct and analyze each job within our organization, we could then come up with what he considered to be the one best way to do the job, teach all of our employees how to do the job in that one best way, monitor their performance to make sure they're doing the job in that one best way, compensate those through pay for performance if they are doing the job in the one best way. If an employee is not following those processes, then we merely get rid of the employee. We fire the employee, we take them out of the machinery of the organization, and we then replace them with a new employee who will then follow this one best way to do the job. One of the primary criticisms against Taylor is that he had a very poor view of human beings. He viewed human beings as being what he called boorish beasts. He said, as boorish beasts, they are not very intelligent, they're not very creative, they don't want to work, you have to force them to work. He said a lot of these employees would engage in a process that he referred to as soldiering. And he used that in a very pejorative way. He said that the process of soldiering is when an employee does just as little as they can get away with to get through the day. So they're not going to try and do any more than what they're required to do. They're going to do as little as they can just to get through the day and not get fired. He wanted to eliminate this soldiering. And so what he believed is that what we could do is we could analyze each job in the organization through these time motion studies. So you literally stand behind somebody as they're doing their job with a stopwatch. You time every single motion that that person takes in doing their job. So the classic example was a shoveling of pig ore. So you had someone with a shovel in their hand standing by a pile of pig ore. Their job was to then put the shovel in the pig ore, pick up a shovel full, take it over to a cart, dump it in the cart, return to the pile, and do it over again. That was their job they were doing on a daily basis. So you stand there and you time every single movement they take. You time them the amount of time it takes them to put the shovel in the pile of pig ore, amount of time it takes them to pick the shovel full up, amount of time it takes them to take it over to a cart, the amount of time it takes them to dump it into the cart, the amount of time it takes them to return to the pile and start the process over again. So what you're doing, your goal is to identify all of what he called the true movements. A true movement was an efficient movement that contributed directly to getting the job done in a quick manner. Identify all those true movements, and all those true movements would then be combined together into the one best way to do the job. Any movements that did not contribute to getting the job done in an efficient manner, he referred to as false movements. All those false movements you would then eliminate, collect all the true movements together, and you then, lo and behold, have the one best way to do the job. Once you've identified this one best way to do the job, you then go out there and hire people who have the skills to do the job in the one best way. You train them how to do it in the one best way. You monitor their performance. You again then compensate them for success. If they're not being successful, they're merely cogs in the machinery. So you take that broken cog, you throw it away, and you put a new cog in. Get rid of that employee, replace them with an employee who can and will do the job in the one best way. So people are just replaceable cogs in the machinery. Obviously, a primary disadvantage of this, primary critique of this, is it's very dehumanizing. It doesn't really take into account the human aspect of organizations, doesn't take into account the social aspect of organizations. It really was treating people in a very negative light. And that's one of the main criticisms that then led to the development of a neoclassical school such as human relations theory. But despite Taylorism having these negative associations of being dehumanizing, we still see a lot of the artifacts of scientific management alive and well in our modern day organizations. So if you're working in an organization, you look at your organization, again, you probably have a job description, a position description. That description will break your job down into its component elements, the skills that are necessary in that job, the knowledge necessary in the job, and then the tasks that are being done on a daily basis, and the amount of time that ideally will be spent on each one of those tasks. That idea of a position description comes directly out of scientific management, those time motion studies. In organizations, we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. One of the primary human resource management functions we engage in is to engage in job analysis. And so what we'll do is we'll analyze each of our individual jobs to understand what those jobs are about so that we can then create those position descriptions. And so we can then use that information to create a position classification system, whereby we can then decide how much we should compensate each one of these positions. So ostensibly, those positions that require more knowledge, skills, and abilities, those positions are going to be compensated at a higher level than what we would typically see with another position that doesn't have those same types of requirements. And next week, when we talk about the management of human resources, we'll talk a bit about job evaluation and how we go about doing job evaluations for the purpose of creating these position classification systems. And then we classify these positions in these systems for the ultimate purpose of assigning compensation. So there's still a whole lot of Frederick Taylor that we tend to see in our modern day public bureaucratic organizations. So that's Frederick Taylor. Again, most of his writing was done focusing on private sector organizations. In the 1920s, scientific management was kind of running rampant throughout the private sector, so much so that public organizations started to see some of the quote unquote success of scientific management and started adopting scientific management into the public sector. And that's kind of how it bled over into the public sector. But Taylor is another example of an author who is not a homegrown public administration theorist. He comes at it from more of a business type of orientation. But he is usually our second classical theorist that we discuss. Again, the big issue that really ties Weber and Taylor together. They were taking this macro level approach. They were looking at how can we make our organizations effective and efficient without paying a whole lot of attention to our individual employees. Then our third author that we usually talk about in the classical school is Luther Gulick. Now, Luther Gulick is a little bit different. Luther Gulick is kind of our first author who really had the opportunity to develop theories and then apply them directly into the public sector. Luther Gulick was a member of the Brownlow Commission. And as I'm sure you all know, and we may have talked a little bit about in a previous class session, as a response to the Great Depression, we had the FDR administration come into office, elected in 1932, comes into office in 1933. As FDR comes into office, FDR has to try and deal with the throes of the Great Depression. And the way in which he does it, as we all know, his New Deal. His New Deal was predicated on this idea of creating all these new federal programs, especially grant and aid programs, and then providing these grants and aid to state and local governments to help pull them out of the depths of the Great Depression. When you create all these new programs, you have to have agencies to administer those programs. And so FDR then created what were called his alphabet agencies. So you had all these agencies that were created that went by their acronyms, SSA, Social Security Administration, all those different types of organizations. And you had this exponential growth in the size of the federal bureaucracy. When you had that exponential growth in the size of the bureaucracy, it became almost impossible for presidents to manage it. And so, therefore, the Brownlow Commission was organized to come up with a way to reorganize the federal bureaucracy to make it easier to manage. Well, that's where Luther Gulick comes in. He was a member of the Brownlow Commission, and this commission then gave him the opportunity to take the theories that he developed and apply them to this reorganization of the federal bureaucracy. So here, really, for the first time, we've got what I guess we would consider to be a public administration theorist who's actually developing theories for public organizations and then applying them directly into those public organizations. Luther Gulick is best known. I see there's a little instability, so I'm going to turn my camera off for just a second. Luther Gulick is one of those theorists who really believed that, much like Weber and Taylor, what we could do is we could develop kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. For Weber, it was the ideal bureaucratic structure. For Taylor, it was the one best way to do the job. For Gulick, the one best way, the one approach was what he called his principal school. That if we could develop these generic universal principles of management and then teach our managers how to use these principles, kind of think about it like a toolkit for managers. So if we can create this managerial toolkit and then provide this toolkit, train our managers in how to use these tools, that is what will make our managers efficient and effective, which will then in turn make our organizations efficient and effective as well. These principles are what Graham Allison referred to in his article as generic management. So these are the generic management functions that are shared by private as well as public organizations. And the school then came to be known as the POSCORP school, standing for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. These functions, these principles are done by all managers, regardless of what sector they are working in. We all engage in planning. We all have to plan the operations of our organization. We have to organize people within our organization, and so on, much in the same way we discussed this when we talked about public-private similarities with that Graham Allison article. But the important thing here, and what Gulick shares with Weber and Taylor, is this one-size-fits-all approach. Just for Gulick, it was creating this managerial toolkit of principles that managers need to adhere to. Gulick, even though he's known as a principles theorist, he is not the only principles theorist. And so we really do need to recognize there are other theorists writing around the same period of time that also were part of this principles approach to studying organizations. Another person who also was part of this principles approach is someone by the name of Henri Fayolle. And Fayolle presents us with kind of an interesting idea here. Fayolle says, yes, management is important. And yes, teaching our managers how to manage is important for organizational efficiency and effectiveness. However, he argues management is not the end all be all. When we are studying organizations, management is just one thing that we should study. Management is part of the larger governance of an organization. Public managers, public leaders, and private managers and private leaders, they govern their organizations. And as they govern their organizations, they manage the allocation of resources, but they also engage in other types of activities as well. As they govern their organizations, they also engage in these technical activities. Technical activities, according to Henri Fail, are those activities that the organization engages in on a daily basis. So as the organization is taking the inputs it receives, the resources it receives, and transforms those resources into outputs, those are the technical activities. So actually implementing these programs and policies, those are the technical activities that are also part of the governance of an organization. You also engage in these commercial activities where you engage in transactions between your organization and people and groups outside of your organization. So you're going to have these commercial types of transactions. You know, we purchase supplies, we enter into contracts with private contractors. Those are our commercial types of transactions. Those also have to be considered within the governance of an organization. We also engage in financial activities. We have to manage our budgets. We have to, make sure that we are spending the money in the way in which it's supposed to be spent and not overspending on our budgets. Those are those financial activities that are also part of the governance of an organization. We also have to engage in security activities where we have to keep our employees safe and secure and also keep our intellectual property safe and secure as well. So you have a lot of these turf wars. And we talked last week about the environment of public administration. We talked about these governing networks and these collaboration efforts, and you wrote about those in your Canvas essay. We have to recognize the fact that when we are collaborating with other organizations, it can leave us kind of vulnerable, can leave us vulnerable to attacks from those other organizations. And so you engage in these security activities. I know I'm sure all of you in your positions probably have to do like cyber threat training. Just finish up my most recent one for here at CSUN. It's a very common type of training that employees have to go through. That's a security type of activity. And accounting activities. And this is especially true in the public sector since we're managing public taxpayer money. We have audit requirements, and you've probably worked in audits before, so you know you oftentimes have external audit requirements. Sometimes you can do some internal audits, but those audit requirements are there for those accounting activities. Adhering to the generally accepted accounting principles and the accounting rules that are given to us by the Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB, things like double entry accounting, things like fund-based accounting. Those are those other activities we engage in, part of the governance of our organizations. So what Fail says is when we think about governing our organizations, we can develop several generic principles that we can then teach to all of our managers to essentially make them more efficient and effective managers, which will in turn help them better govern their organizations. Some of these things are very similar to what we've seen with other classical theorists. So division of work, that's Max Weber's division of labor. Authority creates responsibility, meaning that if we provide people with authority, we delegate authority to our employees, we can then hold them accountable and responsible for those types of jobs that they have been delegated. And so when you delegate authority, you then create responsible employees. You delegate authority through your organization chart, much like with Max Weber. Discipline. You have to have some system of discipline. That's another principle of an effective and efficient organization. You need to have people in the organization who are willing to subordinate their private interests to the general interests. So people who are willing to subordinate their private interests for the achievement of the interests of the organization. You need to have a good system of remuneration. where people are compensated for their efforts. It's kind of this transactional type of relationship. You provide your effort to the organization, you are then compensated for those efforts. Centralization. We still have this tall hierarchy. So we still have this Weberian ideal bureaucratic organization structure that still exhibits this chain of command, that still exhibits this order and orderly processes within our organization. Another principle is equity. We have to treat our employees fairly, not necessarily because it's the right thing to do or it's the ethical thing to do, but rather because treating them fairly will then help get contributions from them to make our organizations efficient and effective. We need to have stable personnel, which is exactly what Max Weber told us about career-oriented employees. We need employees who are willing to take initiative. Now, this is a little bit of a parting of company with some of the other classical theorists. We need employees who will take initiative, and we need to make sure that people feel comfortable taking that initiative. And then we need to have this thing called esprit de corps, which is this feeling of teamwork, this feeling that we are all in this together. We are all part of a team. We're all working toward the same type of outcome. So the similarities here in these classical theorists, again, this is just a sampling of some of those classical theorists. You'll get a lot more of those in a future course. This just kind of gives us an overview. But what really kind of ties these theorists together, Weber, Taylor, Gulick, and Fail, is they're all focusing on essentially what is best for the organization. They're all focusing on how we can make our organizations effective and efficient. Weber said by structure, Taylor said by focusing on work process, coming up with the one best way to do the job. Gulick and Fail tell us you can do it through establishing these principles, teaching our managers how to engage in these principles, and if they adhere to these principles, this will then make our organizations efficient and effective. Now, clearly, not everyone bought in to the classical school. And to give you a couple of examples, one example I don't have on here is there were a couple of major public administration theorists who really took issue with the principal school. People like our good friend Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo. These are two heavyweights in public administration that you're going to run into again and again throughout your time in this program. Herb Simon was a big critic of the principal school. He actually referred to the principal school in a pejorative way as being the school of proverbs rather than the school of principles. He argued that they weren't principles, they were proverbs. And as proverbs, they are basically stories that can cancel each other out. So if you go back and look at some of these principles and Fail, he says that, well, maybe if you're focusing on division of work, that cancels out initiative. If you're focusing on discipline, that could cancel out esprit de corps, this feeling of teamwork. If you're focusing on centralization, then again, you're canceling out initiative. That they kind of cancel each other out, just like sometimes one proverb, one story will cancel out another proverb or another story. So he referred to it as the proverb school as opposed to the principal school. Dwight Waldo also took issue with the principal school by saying that there was an undercurrent to the principal school, and that undercurrent in the principal school was the undercurrent of exploitation. That the principles theorists like Fail and Gulick were exploiting employees to get the contributions from them to then make our organizations effective. And that these principles were actually based upon the idea of exploiting employees to benefit the overall organization. So both Simon and Waldo were both very, very critical of the principal school. And I'll avoid saying Simon says, I'll just say that was Simon's theory. Also, the neoclassical theorists, people like Mary Parker Follett and Elton Mayo, recognized that the classical school of thought was, again, very dehumanizing. When referring to people as boorish beasts, as cogs in the machinery, we are taking a very dim view of human nature. We also understood that the classical schools suffer from the flaw of almost completely ignoring the social aspects of organizations. I don't know why it says organizations, but organizations. meaning that organizations are social environments. People are social creatures. And as social creatures in a social environment, we have to understand those social influences. The classical school pretty much ignored all of those social influences. But probably one of the biggest criticisms that more modern public organization theorists have against the classical school is that they saw the classical school as a search for the one best approach, the one size fits all approach. And what we have learned throughout our study of public organizations is that there is no one size fits all approach. Everything is very much contextual. And we have to understand the situation, the context of the situation we're dealing with to understand how most efficiently and effectively to deal with those issues and those situations as public administrators. So because of all those flaws associated with the classical school, we then saw the rise of some of these neoclassical schools, some of these newer schools, such as the Human Relations School, the Human Resource Management School, the Systems School, and then some more modern approaches, such as the Quality Management School, Organization Culture School, and then much more contemporary, the School of Leadership Theories. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on in the class. But these are all what we call our neoclassical schools. They were all generated because they saw flaws in the schools that preceded them. So let's start with our first, what we consider to be neoclassical school of thought in the literature, and that's what we consider to be the human relations school. Now, this first author that we talk about is Mary Parker Follett. And if you haven't read Mary Parker Follett before or talked about Mary Parker Follett in some other undergraduate courses, Mary Parker Follett was a very prolific writer. She wrote primarily in the early 1900s. A lot of her most important writings were done in the teens and the 1920s. But one of the primary contributions that Mary Parker Follett made to the literature was her recognition and really courage to speak up and point out all these flaws that were inherent within the classical school, especially Frederick Taylor's scientific management. Now, one of the problems for Mary Parker Follett is that she was writing at a period of time when there weren't a whole lot of female theorists, if any. And so a lot of the theories that she developed in the early 1900s were 20, 30, 40 years before their time. They were 20 or 30 years before other human resource or human relations theorists actually developed similar theories. So the problem is that people like Chester Barnard and Elton Mayo really didn't know any of Mary Parker Follett's theories because she was a female writing in the 1920s. But I think she really was kind of this, what I like to call a lone voice in the wilderness. She was that one person who was willing to stand up as scientific management was catching on like wildfire throughout the private and public sector. She was that one person who was willing to stand up and say, wait a second, there are some serious fatal issues with scientific management. That's why she's one of my favorite theorists. And I also like her a lot because she recommends to us that we think about our organizations as kind of mini democracies. Now, there's kind of a nice segue here between Fail and Follett. Remember, Fail, even though he was a classical theorist, or we consider him a classical theorist in this class, he talked about the importance of governing organizations and how management is just one of those aspects of governing an organization. Follett is also very interested in the governance of an organization, but she argues that we need to govern our organizations as democracies. She argued for democratic organizations. Follett says when you look at a system of democracy, democracies, despite all of their advantages, there are two fundamental flaws in most democratic systems: passive citizens and particularized interests. So she says in most democracies, democracies are predicated upon the idea that people can participate in their own self-governance, their own self-determination. However, the avenue that they select to participate in their own self-governance will probably be the avenue that costs them the least in terms of time and resources. As human beings, we typically tend to be rational, self-interested actors. And that's not a pejorative look at human nature. I think it's just a reality that we try to engage in behaviors that will maximize our benefits while minimizing our costs. So if you're a rational, self-interested actor and you're looking at how to participate in your own self-determination, you're going to look at methods that will be the least costly for you. The least costly method to participate is obviously voting, especially here in the state of California, where you get a ballot in the mail and you can fill it out at home and drop it in the mailbox. It's a very low cost way to participate in terms of time as well as energy and resources. So people tend to participate by voting. That's a very passive way of participation as compared to all the other ways you can participate, such as running for office, working on a campaign, doing what we call door knocks, knocking on doors for the benefit of a specific candidate. All of those things contributing to campaigns, all of those things require more energy and time and resources than simply voting. So democracies create passive citizens. Democratic organizations can also create passive employees, where employees are working within these stringent organization structures, and they oftentimes become very passive. They come in, they do their job, they leave. They really don't have a lot of avenues for participating in their own governance within their organizations. So she says what we need to do to deal with passivity on the part of our employees is to afford them opportunities to participate. So we need an open system of communication horizontally and well as vertically in our organizations and provide our employees with the opportunity to participate in decision making. By giving them those opportunities, they become much more active employees. They'll have much more buy-in in the success of the organization. The second fundamental flaw of a democracy is the same type of thing that James Madison told us, which is particularized interests. Federalist Paper number 10, Madison warned us about factions. He said, factions are a natural outgrowth of a compound republic. We're going to have factions, and factions are going to lead to conflict. Whenever you have these particularized interests, these factions that lead to conflict, you need to have an effective way of dealing with that conflict. So she said, if we run our organizations as kind of mini democracies, we are by definition going to have conflict. Madison told us we cannot eliminate conflict by eliminating factions. They are a natural outgrowth of a democracy. Instead, what we do is we control their effects, and we control the effects of factions by balancing one particularized group against another particularized group. But we're still going to have conflict between them. So Follett says for a strong democratic organization, we need to come up with an effective way of dealing with this conflict. We're going to allow people to participate. We're going to allow them to participate in this quote unquote marketplace of ideas where they can share their ideas with others. We're going to have to find out a way in which we can control the conflict that will naturally occur. One way to control conflict, she says, is through domination. She said that's the worst way to do it because one party wins, one party loses. This is kind of that overt power in those three faces of power of John Gaventa that we talked about several class sessions ago. The second way is through compromise. So we compromise, we come through negotiation, we come up with a negotiated compromise. I give up something, you give up something. We are both never happy. And we're never happy because we both gave something up to come to this negotiated compromise. It's better than domination, but it is still not the most appropriate way in a democratic organization. The most appropriate way of dealing with conflict, she says, is through integration. So through integration, what we do is we allow people to participate. They share ideas. As people share those ideas interpenetrate from one person to another. That interpenetration of ideas allows us to create this synthesis of ideas to come up with a synthesis of a solution. That synthesized solution doesn't come from one group or another. It's something we have created together as an organization. And since we have all created this synthesized solution together, we can then buy into that solution better. So she says, through this interpenetration of ideas that comes from participation, we then integrate those ideas together into a solution that everyone has some buy-in. They have some skin in the game, if you will. So her democratic organizations are organizations that really value employee participation and employee communication. Now, on a Monday evening in a 610 classroom setting, That sounds very nice, and that's all well and good. However, we also have to recognize that sometimes there are situations where organizations don't have the time or the bandwidth to encourage participation of all stakeholders. Sometimes decisions must be made very, very quickly, and you can't have the gridlock that oftentimes comes along with this type of participation. So, yes, we want democratic leadership, but we have to understand that that democratic leadership can have boundaries depending upon the situation we find ourselves in. Mary Parker Follett was also well known for her situational leadership theories, where she says we lead our organizations based upon the situation. Sometimes we can be democratic leaders, at other times, the job has to get done, and we have to respond very quickly. And so you may have a little bit less participation. So I think she was a little bit more realistic about not being able to be democratic perhaps 100% of the time in our bureaucratic organizations. But you can kind of see the importance of Mary Parker Follett because she was the one person who was standing up in the 1920s and taking issues with the dehumanizing top-down centralization approach of the classical theorists. And then her objections that she lodged in the 1920s were then lodged by later human relations theorists like Elton Mayo and Chester Barnard. So I think she really was very much a pioneer in the field of public administration literature. A second human relations theorist, and I should say a caveat here is a lot of people, when they talk about human relations theory, they will not consider Mary Parker Follett as a human relations theorist just because she was writing so early on. A lot of people refer to her as a pre-human relations theorist. And whenever I teach organization theory and behavior, one of the textbooks I like to use by Jonathan Tompkins, he actually does refer to her as a pre-human relations theorist. And he devotes an entire chapter to Mary Parker Follett as kind of the segue into human relations theory, just kind of in a chronological type of perspective. But another human relations theorist that I like to cover in this class, that you'll cover in a future course as well, is Chester Barnard. And Chester Barnard kind of pops up in a lot of different contexts throughout the public administration literature. Here in our discussion of the literature focusing on public organizations, his primary contribution is that he says to be an effective leader or manager, you are only effective if you can get the compliance on the part of your employees. So it's not so much just telling an employee to do something and expecting them to do it as you would do in the classical school with Weber and Taylor and Gulick and Fail. Now you have to try and persuade them and get their compliance in order to be effective. Barnard really did view this relationship between managers and their employees as a transactional relationship. He was very much of a transactional leadership theorist. He said, in order to get contributions from our employees, we have to provide them with the right selective incentives that they value. And if we provide them with the right selective incentives, those selective incentives will then induce them to provide the contributions that we need. So contributions we need from employees are things such as consistent effort, providing effort on a consistent basis. That's usually what the motivation literature refers to as motivation. People are motivated if they are willing to provide this effort on a consistent basis, their willingness to exert effort on a consistent basis. So we need their effort. We need their loyalty to the organization. We need their intellect. We need their skill set. We need their creativity. Those are all the efforts. Those are all the contributions that we need to get from our employees. And if we incentivize our employees, they will then provide us with those contributions. Chester Barnard's transactional type of relationship here gave rise to one of my favorite theories, which is what's called Vroom's expectancy theory. And if you in the future end up taking my MPA 623A course in public sector effectiveness, we spent some time talking about Vroom and expectancy theory. Essentially, what Vroom says, building off of Barnard, is if we want to motivate our employees to give us the contributions we need, we have to provide them with the outcomes that they place a value upon. It's what Vroom referred to as the valence level. So the valence level of an outcome is how much an employee values that outcome. So if you want an employee to perhaps come in and work on the weekend to get this very important report done by Monday morning, they're putting forth that effort to come in on the weekend and to work on that report, even though there are other things that they would prefer to do. So you need to incentivize that. How can you incentivize that? Well, we're very limited in the public sector. We can't provide them with pay for performance like you would do in the private sector. So instead, we might have to incentivize it through recognition. So this will award you with Employee of the Month if you put forth this effort. Well, if a person doesn't care about being recognized as Employee of the Month, they're going to place a very low valence level on being Employee of the Month, and that's not going to motivate them to put forth this effort. So we have to understand our individual employees and how much they value these incentives, provide them with the right set of incentives that they value to extract the contributions we need to make our organizations effective and efficient. Also, Barnard recognized that not only are individual employees different in terms of the values they place upon incentives, but they're also different in terms of the values they hold as individuals. That people have different ethical standards, they have different norms and values and expectations. If we ask someone to do something that violates their ethical standards, we are going to get pushback from that person, and they are not going to provide those contributions. So what we need to do, according to Barnard, is we need to work within employees' zone of indifference. That every employee has a zone of indifference. The zone of indifference is where people are kind of ambivalent. You ask them to do something that doesn't violate their ethics or violate their value system. They're probably going to comply. They're probably going to acquiesce because you're within that zone of indifference. However, if you get outside of that zone of indifference and you ask them to do something that violates their ethical principles, that's when you're going to get pushback and you're not going to get those contributions. Well, as we've talked about many times in this class, my favorite question is, well, so what? The so what here, in terms of Barnard's contribution to our understanding of organizations, is that he tells us we need to understand that each employee is an individual. Each employee is a human being who has a different zone of indifference and a different valence that they will place upon these selective incentives. So we have to know our employees and we have to understand the differences between our employees. So our employees are no longer these replaceable cogs in the machinery as they were in the classical theories of people like Frederick Taylor. Now we know they are different human beings and we have to treat them differently. That's a big advancement, if you will, that he contributed to what's called human relations school of thought. Then another human relations theorist that we highlight in this course is Elton Mayo. And I'm sure in some previous undergraduate courses, you've probably run into Elton Mayo before. Elton Mayo and his colleagues did a series of different types of experiments with human subjects. He was a big believer in kind of the psychological approach of collecting information directly from human beings. And one of his most famous studies was the Hawthorne experiments. In the Hawthorne experiments, he and his colleagues went into the Hawthorne electrical plant. And what they wanted to see is they wanted to see what are some of the determinants of worker productivity. So what determines how productive workers are going to be? So he starts with a physical stimulus. He said, let's start very simple. So if we alter a physical stimulus, such as something as simple as the level of lighting within the factory, if we turn up the level of lighting, people will be able to see better and they'll become more productive. So they turned up the lighting level, and sure enough, people became more productive. But what confounded him and his colleagues is they said, well, let's do the opposite. If we turn the lighting level down, we would assume that productivity will go down. So they turned down the lights, they made it harder to see. Productivity levels went up even higher and went above where they were when the lighting level was up. That was, again, a confounding result to their hypothesis. What they found is obviously the reason why people were being more productive is they were being paid attention to. The researchers were asking them about what they thought about the jobs that they were doing on a daily basis, how they felt about their jobs, how they felt about the organization, about their leaders and their managers. And people were actually listening to them and paying attention to them. That kind of shows us the social aspect of an organization, that people are social creatures working within a social structure, and that organizations are just not formal. They have this informal social aspect to them as well. He and his colleagues also saw that groups tended to perform better than individuals. Now, this wasn't just the result of collective skills being greater than individual skills, but it was that if one member of the group was not working hard enough, that was making the rest of the group look bad. And so other members of the group would put pressure on that individual, get that individual to work a little bit harder, and their productivity would go up. So he recognized that we have social organizations, and within those social organizations, we have formal as well as informal groups. And we have to understand these social dynamics before we can understand how to make our organizations effective and efficient. So you can see why Elton Mayo is really squarely in the school of human relations, because he's understanding that we have to treat people as human beings and we have to recognize their social requirements as human beings. However, taken together, the human relations school still had the same ultimate goal as the classical school. And that ultimate goal was organizational effectiveness, efficiency, and productivity. So the focus was still on the macro level of what is the best interest of the organization. Mary Parker Follett told us creating democratic organizations predicated upon participation of employees, that is what will benefit the organization and make it effective and efficient and productive. Chester Barnard said finding these transactional relationships between our individual employees, getting their compliance, that's what will make us effective and efficient. Altameo said recognizing the social aspect, the social environment, that's what will make us more productive as an organization. But their ultimate goal was still organizational effectiveness and productivity. It was still the macro level over the micro level of what's good for the individual. So critics of the human relations school, such as our human resource management theorists, said that that was a primary flaw in the human relations school, is that it was still being exploitative. It was still exploiting workers to get what you could out of them to then make the organization better. And so because of those criticisms of the human relations school, we then have the rise of the human resource management school. And in the human resource management school, we start looking at the relationship between our employees and our organizations as a two-way street. So to take the old JFK phrase and switch it up a little bit, we're no longer asking what the individual can do for the organization. Now we're also asking what can the organization do for the individual? How can the organization help the individual meet their needs and to develop these individual employees as human resources? So it now becomes incumbent upon the organization to help develop our employees for the benefit of those employees, even if developing our employees as human resources will not directly benefit the organization. So the whole idea of giving professional development training to our employees, and those employees then leaving the organization to go to higher level positions in other organizations. In human resource management theory, that is okay. That is still something that is worthwhile doing. I just actually saw a commercial on TV not very long ago for a major company. I'm not advertising, but it was Walmart. And Walmart in their commercial talking about all the professional development opportunities that they provide. And they had employee testimonials. And one of the employees was saying, and yeah, I got all this training, and then I actually went to a different company. I no longer work for Walmart, but I'm extolling the virtues of Walmart because they helped to develop my skills and allow me the opportunity to go elsewhere. Again, it's not advertised for Walmart. It's just basically that was a commercial that I saw. And I think it kind of illustrates this whole idea of human resource management theory relatively well. So that's a big difference between human resource management theory and human relations theory. Now we're looking at what is also in the best interest of our employees outside of just the best interests of the organization. So a more micro as opposed to macro level approach. Three of the authors that we oftentimes highlight in human resource management theory: Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor, and Chris Argyris. Now, Abraham Maslow, you've probably run into before if you had any type of psychology course at the undergraduate level. Maslow really built his theories out of the world of psychology. So here we are borrowing some kind of psychological theories and then applying them to understanding public organizations. As you probably know, Maslow is best known for his hierarchy of needs. Every employee has a hierarchy of needs, and they are motivated by a deficiency in needs. And so basically, you have five levels of needs. The bottom four needs, physiological, safety, belonging, and esteem needs, those are what he calls deficiency needs. People are motivated if they have a deficiency in one of these needs. So, physiological, if you don't have enough food, you don't have enough water, you don't have enough shelter, you're going to be motivated to find food, water, and shelter. Once you have located adequate food, water, and shelter, that no longer serves as a motivator for you. You have filled that deficiency. It is no longer going to motivate you. Same type of thing with safety needs, belongingness needs, and esteem needs. Safety needs, we all have to feel that we're safe and secure from harm. Belonging needs, we want to feel that we belong to something, a family, a group of friends, an organization, a team. Those are our social belonging types of needs. Esteem needs. We need to feel that we are held in high esteem by others, our coworkers, our family members, our community. We need to be held in high esteem. Those are your four deficiency needs, motivated by a deficiency in one of those needs. At the apex, you have self-actualization. That is what he calls a being or a growth need. This one never ends. So we are always motivated by trying to grow. Self-actualization is essentially becoming all that you can be, achieving your utmost potential. So we are always motivated to grow and try to achieve our utmost potential. We're always motivated to try and self-actualize. And that's what sets self-actualization apart from those deficiency-based types of needs. Well, here we go with our favorite question again. So what? Now, what does that mean for our study of organizations? It means that we need to understand our individual employees and focus on their needs. So it's not just about the organization's needs, it's about how the organization can help the individual employee satisfy their own needs. Also, this ordering of these needs may be different for different employees. So there's no one size fits all approach that every employee has the same hierarchy of needs. That hierarchy may shift and be different depending upon individual employee. Now, the chart you see on the screen, the little pyramid you see on the screen, that's a depiction of Maslow's kind of traditional hierarchy of needs. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't recognize that Maslow, as he approached the end of his career and the end of his life, revisited this very classical hierarchy of needs. And this is still today a very common approach, a very common theory that's used. However, he reassessed it. And as part of his reassessment, he kind of changed up that self-actualization growth need. And he said in his new hierarchy of needs, no longer is it just self-actualization, being all you can be as an individual, but instead it's more of a legacy-based type of need. What type of legacy can you leave when you are gone? How can you provide back to your community and make your community a better place? So his kind of legacy approach kind of goes beyond just the individual needs and actually says, how are I really contributing to the needs of the bigger community and the bigger society? So it's kind of a way in which he revised it a little bit to make it a little bit more of a not so individual based, not so much of a self-serving type of basis, but more what can I leave for my community? But Maslow's telling us we have to know each of our individual employees, and the organization then has to try and help that employee meet those needs. Douglas McGregor, our second human resource management theorist, really was a very big believer in Abraham Maslow. And so he built his theories off of Maslow's theories. McGregor presents us with theory X and theory Y. Not very creative names, but they serve their purpose. Theory X. Theory X tells us that employees tend to be very lazy. They are not terribly intelligent. They are not creative. They do not seek out responsibility. They basically are these soldiering types of employees that Frederick Taylor told us about back in the classical school. So it's a very classical school approach to understanding human behavior and human nature. What he called Theory X. Theory Y is just the complete opposite, diametrically opposed. And so, theory Y, we assume that people are intelligent, they're creative, they seek out supervisory positions, they want authority and responsibility. They're, again, much warmer and fuzzier, if you will, a much more optimistic view of individuals and individual human nature. And that's what we refer to as theory Y. Well, so what? The so what is he said that the majority of our employees and organizations are theory Y types of employees. They're intelligent, they're creative, they're theory Y employees. Now, not everyone. He will admit that there are some clunkers in organizations. We still have some theory Xers, but the majority of our employees are theory Ys. However, they're Theory Y employees working within Theory X organizations. Whereas most of our employees are Theory Y, the vast majority of our organizations are classical Theory X organizations. They're Weberian, Taylor-esque types of organizations. So we are shoehorning these Theory Y employees into Theory X organizations. In order to solve that problem, what we need to do is we need to transform our organizations from Theory X into Theory Y organizations. Question is, how can we do that? One of the most effective ways we can do that is through a practice known as job enrichment. So we allow people to participate in the redesign of their jobs, the enrichment of their jobs, where we allow them to participate in redesigning their jobs so that they can have the opportunity to develop the types of skills they want to develop to continue becoming more theory Y in their orientation. So we allow people to participate in determining what their jobs will be so that they can fashion their jobs so that those jobs can help them develop as human resources. So, the example would be if someone wants to be a city manager one day, and so therefore we allow them through job enrichment to have the opportunity to work in different departments in the city. And work in those different departments, they build the skills they need, understanding what all the different parts of the city do, so that you can combine all that together and then help them become city managers in the future. Now, they may become a city manager in another city, and they may leave the city that they're in, but helping them develop as human resources is a goal in and of itself, irrespective of necessarily what it gives back to the organization. Not just what the individual can do for the organization, what can the organization do for the individual? And then Chris Ardress, our third human resource management theorist, was a student of Douglas McGregor, and he took McGregor's theories and expanded upon them. And the primary contribution that Chris Ardress makes for us is his development of the personal growth theory. And according to Chris Ardress, employees are not just either Theory Y or Theory X. Employees can become more Theory Y as they go through their personal growth journey. Every employee goes through a maturation process, just like every individual human being goes through a maturation process. As you go through your maturation process, you will develop more Theory Y types of characteristics. You will become more interested in a long-term perspective as opposed to short-term. So you start wondering more about 5, 10, 15 years down the road as opposed to tomorrow morning. So they take on a longer-term perspective. They become more invested and more involved in the community around them. So, they vote more. They work on campaigns more. They become more invested. They work in nonprofits and start up nonprofits and start up programs to maybe help less fortunate in the community. They become more invested, more active in their communities. They aspire to superordinate positions. They aspire to supervisory level positions. They seek out responsibility and seek out authority. Those are all parts of this personal growth journey that really transforms someone into even more of a Theory Y employee. Well, here's our so what question again. So what? What's it mean for an organization? It means that organizations need to help their employees through this personal growth process. They need to help their employees move through this personal growth process and become more Theory Y in their orientation. So it's incumbent upon the organization to help the personal growth process of their individual employees. So the big difference here between human resource management school and human relations school is that now it's not just all about the organization. Now it's about helping individual employees meet their own needs to develop as human resources for the benefit of the individual employee, not just for the benefit of the overall organization. Chronologically, when we're talking human resource management theory, we are talking that school, we're talking about 1950s and 1960s and the 70s and the 80s. And our Joyce was writing and researching relatively several years ago. And so really does kind of take us into the contemporary period. The reason why we have a lot of these offices of human resources, human resource management offices in our organizations because of a lot of the needs we have for professional development and training for our employees. Also, in addition to just how complex the process of managing human resources has become with public sector unionization and the career civil service system. That's a school we call Human Resource Management School. Again, what can the organization do for the individual employee? So far less exploitative than what we saw in the Human Relations School. Then another school that we talk about in this class is the School of Systems Theory. In systems theory, we're talking about primarily beginning with natural systems theory in the 1950s and really moving forward to the current period of time. Now, we talked a lot about systems theory last week when we talked about environmental influences. We said that as we look at the environment and public administration, we recognize that organizations are part of a larger whole, that organizations are part of their surrounding environment. And so to understand organizations, we have to understand their role in the system. And last week, as we talked about that, we compared closed natural systems theory to open systems theory. We talked about how in closed systems theory, you looked at an organization as a living organism. From the moment an organism comes into being, it dissipates energy into its environment until eventually it doesn't have the energy and resources to support itself and then goes out of existence. We identified that as the entropy process. We said the goal of closed natural systems theorists is that organizations all trend toward the steady state, this balance known as homeostasis. And again, this is all information that we had covered last week. We said in contrast, you have your open systems theory. And open systems theory, we're more concerned about the surrounding external environment. We are more concerned about how the organization interacts with its external environment. And we say not only do organizations dissipate energy and resources into their environment as they age, but they also go through this thing called a negative entropy process where they import new energies from their environment in terms of labor pools, in terms of money, in terms of political and citizen support. So they can replace the resources they're losing by importing these new resources in. That negative entropy process then allows them to find their balance between the organization and the environment. And when the organization and the environment are in balance with each other, that's the point of homeostasis. That's the steady state that open systems theorists are looking for. Open systems theorists are people like Katz and Kahn. But to move to open systems theory from closed systems theory, and I don't know if we really mentioned this a lot last week, we had to have a segue. We had to have a transition. So the transition from closed natural systems to open systems theory came to us from this person by the name of Robert Merton. And Merton is the one who talked to us a lot about this concept we talked about earlier tonight, goal displacement. And what Merton says is that organizations are not living organisms. So he really challenged the contention of an organization as a living organism that was the primary underpinning of closed natural systems theory. He argued that organizations did not always do everything to help them survive, that not all of the behaviors that organizations engage in were geared toward helping that agency survive. Sometimes organizations do some things that are kind of irrational, that don't necessarily make sense for organizational survival. So he says organizations really aren't living organisms. Instead, what we see with organizations is we see this institutional rigidity cycle we talked about earlier. That as organizations go through their life cycle, They tend to develop more rules and regulations, and they become more fixated on those rules and regulations. So their goal is to adhere to the rules and regulations, as opposed to the goal being to try and meet the wants, needs, and desires of their constituents. That type of goal displacement is what he calls a bureaucratic dysfunction. So he says what organizations need to do instead is, instead of focusing on rules and regulations, they need to focus on the consequences, the outcomes that they are providing to their beneficiaries. So all these programs and policies that we implement on a daily basis in our public organizations, those programs and those policies, those goods and those services are designed to meet some type of a goal for some type of an outcome or a consequence for beneficiaries. So if we have an income subsidy program, a general assistance program, the purpose of that general assistance program is to provide income to income eligible households to increase their disposable spendable income. That's the outcome. That's the consequence. So instead of just asking, are we making sure everyone is abiding exactly by these eligibility principles, we instead become more interested in, well, what does this income subsidy program actually mean for the spending power of these households? What type of outcome is it really having? So the importance of here with Merton as being a segue is that he pushes our focus from the internal operations of the organization to what does it mean for the stakeholders in the larger external environment. And so Merton's theory really does help push us from the closed natural systems theory approach to this more open systems theory approach, looking at the impact the organization is having on its external environment. But systems theory, even though we saw a lot of this writing being done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, as we saw last week, systems theories can be considered to be a contemporary theory because the basic assumption of most of the analysis we do of our public organizations today is that they are part of a larger system. We usually do not study agencies in isolation. We usually look at their collaborative governing networks and how they interact with their surrounding environment. So as we also had said last week, it's really hard for us to find a public or nonprofit organization that operates in a closed system. Just about all of our organizations operate in some type of an open system. So that's the system school we talked about last week and just kind of done as a refresher this week to kind of show you where it fits in terms of the chronology of the evolution of public organization theory. Another school of thought that I'm sure you will talk about in future courses is the school of quality management. Now, quality management, if you've taken any classes in business, you're very familiar with quality management, and people like Deming, who is a primary champion of quality management. Deming with quality management argued that in order to make our organizations effective, what we need to do is to focus on the quality of the outputs that we are creating. So in the private sector, the outputs that we are creating are pretty easy to measure. They're pretty quantitative and empirical. Sometimes the outputs we're creating, as we've said before, in the public sector are a little bit softer. They're a little bit more qualitative, a little bit more difficult to measure. But Deming makes the argument, if we could measure the quality of the output that we are creating, that is a strong indicator of the effectiveness of our organization. Now, quality management was initially developed for the private sector. Deming got a very cool reception when he tried to introduce it to private corporations here in the US. So based upon that very cool reception, he then decided to take his theories overseas. And he took his approach of quality management to Japan, got a much warmer reception in Japan. We saw a lot of Japanese companies, especially car makers, who adopted quality management, adopted these very stringent quality control standards for the cars that they were then building. And then those cars, once they were exported into America, then you saw a lot of consumers saying, these are high quality cars. These Hondas and Toyotas and all these cars coming from overseas had very high quality standards. And that then induced a lot of American automakers to start to buy into quality management and then start implementing quality management. Years ago, Ford had their tagline, quality is job one. meaning that quality is built into the job of building every single Ford vehicle. That's quality management. Quality management then started to be extended into the public sector. But the problem with using it in the public sector, we found, is that there are a lot of obstacles. In the public sector, we've got a lot of fragmentation in that we have different power bases that are fragmented across different levels of government, across different agencies, across different individuals. That fragmentation can make it very difficult for us to engage in pure quality management. And as we said before, most notably, most of the things that we create, the products we create in the public sector, just don't really lend themselves to these types of quality control inspections, these types of quality of control mechanisms. When you're trying to enhance the quality of life of an individual, that's going to be somewhat difficult for you to measure in terms of quality management. But quality management is important to recognize because, again, kind of shows some of the differences between the private and public sector. But it was something in the 1980s and the 1990s that we really saw adopted into the public sector with a limited amount of success. But I know we're running pretty long in the tooth now. We're hitting 7:30. So let me just introduce one more what's considered to be contemporary theory for you to kind of show you how far we have come in the evolution of the public administration literature. And that last school of thought is the school of organization culture. And we have mentioned this in this class before. Every organization tends to have its own culture. When we define culture, as we talked about before, culture is a set of norms and expectations for behavior that a group of people share. We have political cultures in countries. And so in our political culture, there are some values and some standards that we expect in terms of behavior in our political culture. You can certainly make an argument that political culture is evolving and changing, but that political culture tends to be unique as compared to other political cultures around the world. That type of set of norms, expectations, and values also will exist within public organizations. So every organization has its own organization culture. In order to study an organization today, we have to understand the unique culture of that organization. Studying an organization culture means that we can study different levels of that culture. There are three basic levels of culture. Organizations create things such as artifacts. So artifacts are things like minutes from meetings, agendas from meetings, policy and procedure manuals. Those are the artifacts. Those are the tangible things that are created by an organization that we can study to understand what that organization values and believes in. It's like an archaeological dig. You would dig up an eating utensil. When you study an organization culture, you dig up these agendas and these minutes to give you insight into that organization. In NASPA, we do this all the time on our site visits where we require programs to show us their agendas and their minutes. Second level of culture is our espoused values. With espoused values, what we are doing is we are looking at what the organization tells us it values. So its mission statement, when the organization says, this is who we are and this is why we exist. The organization's vision statement, where the organization tells us, this is what we want to be someday. This is where we want to see ourselves when we essentially grow up as an organization. The strategic plans, where we say, here are our public sector values that underlie our mission statement and underlie all the goals and objectives we have established in this strategic plan. Espoused values are relatively easy to see because they are espoused. The organization tells you, here are the things we value as an organization. What is much more difficult for us to study is this third level of culture, basic assumptions. Every culture will have its own set of basic assumptions. Basic assumptions, for instance, about how we assume we treat each other as colleagues. So we assume we treat each other in a civil manner, collegially and professionally. Unless you have a code of civility in your organization, you probably don't talk a lot about those assumptions. We just all, in an unspoken way, assume that we will be treated in a professional and a collegial type of manner. Since these are basic assumptions that are not spoken, they are much more difficult for us to study as we study organization culture. Different organizations have different cultures based upon their history, as well as based upon their leadership. When new leaders come into organizations, they can embed a new culture into that organization. They can embed new cultures into organizations by embedding new slogans, by embedding expectations in terms of this type of behavior gets rewarded, this type of behavior gets disciplined or sanctioned. So that includes in employees that these behaviors are things that the organization actually does value. So the big so what question here obviously is if every organization has its own unique culture, we can no longer have a one size fits all approach. It's now impossible for us to find those panaceas. Now we have to develop theories that are unique to the individual organizations. So the upshot of all this is public organization theory literature has told us that in studying contemporary modern organizations, we need to take a much more idiosyncratic approach. It's a much more complex, complicated way of studying public organizations. So the movement really has been this movement away from the one size fits all approach to a much more situational, contextual, and as I like to say, it depends approach to studying public organizations. So that's kind of a very brief hour and a half overview of about 150 years of public administration theory literature. Again, the reason why we do this here is to kind of give you an idea of how we have viewed organizations in the past and how we should manage and lead our organizations compared to how we view more contemporary organizations today. You will get into a lot more detail in all these schools of thought and these theories as you move forward in your courses in the program. But this just kind of gives you a little bit of a 30,000 foot overview of some of these theories and these schools of thought as you begin the program in this introductory course. I know I've been talking for a long time so far tonight, so I'm going to stop talking for a while. Are there any questions, any clarifications needed, any observations on this discussion of the different schools of thought in public organization theory literature? Okay. If not, then I think we're due for, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Natalie, go ahead.
So this is a question in regards to the project. I'm a little confused about the directions. Is this like task force something that's going to be like temporary to help employees' job easier, or can you provide example maybe?
Sure. Yeah, it could be either. It could be something that is temporary, that is just established to deal with a current situation. So, you had a global pandemic, you had COVID-19, and so you created some organizations created a task force that would deal with how to distribute the COVID-19 relief money. And so that was a temporary task force. And once the COVID pandemic was essentially over, and all that money then started to expire, the task force then went out of existence. So it can be very temporary, something like that. It could be something more permanent. And so if you're putting together a task force to look at dealing with the homelessness issue in a certain area, the homelessness issue is something that is what we call a wicked public policy problem. So it's something that is not going to disappear overnight. It's something that's kind of an all government type of approach. That's probably going to take many, many years for us to try and hopefully alleviate and mitigate that problem. So that would be a much more permanent type of task force. If you're thinking within an organization, maybe there's a problem in your organization, such as employee turnover. And the organization recognizes that there are high levels of employee turnover. They want to enhance employee retention. So they put together a task force within the organization, or maybe they see other organizations that are suffering from the same problem. They'll put together a task force to help mitigate this problem of employee turnover. How long that task force lasts will depend upon the success it has in addressing that issue. If it has a lot of success addressing the issue and employee retention rates go way up in the participating organizations, There may not be a need for that task force, and all those initiatives that task force came up with may all be then embedded within the policies and procedures of those member organizations. And so that task force can then go out of existence. If that problem is not mitigated and it continues on, then maybe that task force will continue on for a longer period of time. So not to, give you a long-winded answer, but it can be temporary, it can be permanent. It really depends upon the type of issue that you want to try and address with the task force. Does that help?
Okay. Yeah, something as broad as like homelessness, if there's task force already out there that's kind of similar, would it be okay to still kind of pick that subject?
Yeah, you absolutely could because you can look at that task force that exists, and maybe that task force has not been as successful as you would like to see, and there could be some flaws in that task force. So you propose the creation of a different task force that hopefully would be more effective. Absolutely. So I mean, if there's already a task force existing, if the task force that you're putting together you feel will do a better job, by all means, you can certainly create a task force on that issue.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And those are excellent questions. So I'm glad you asked those. Okay, let's take a break and we'll take about let's say about a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 7:50 and then I have like we normally do our breakout room assignment. It allows you to not have to listen to me anymore and also allows you to work together and get to know each other a little bit better. So for the breakout room assignment we're going to use the information we covered here in the first half of class, looking at your organizations as a group. Think about which of these theories were presented in the first half of class best represent your organization. Give me a couple of examples of how you see those theories in your organization. And then as always, we'll select a spokesperson for each group. But before we get there, take a break until 7:50, come back, and then I'll put you in the breakout groups and we'll have our exercise. Okay, let me go ahead. I've created some breakout groups. As normal, I've created 4 rooms. So we'll have about 9 or so in each room. What I'm again asking you to do is think about your organizations, or if you're not in an organization, organizations that you are familiar with or interested in, and then using the information we've covered in the first half of class 9 and all these theories that we presented, think about some of the theories that are best represented by your organization. They can be classical theories, they can be some of the neoclassical theories, just kind of a sampling. It doesn't have to be a laundry list and exhaustive of all the theories, but just an example of some of the theories that you tend to see at use in your organization. And give me a couple of examples of why you're saying you see those theories in your organization. And as always, if each one of our rooms can then select a spokesperson, because it's 7:51. So let's see if we can do this, get it done by 8:15. So I'll give you a couple of warnings along the way, but we'll try and close out our rooms at 8:15, reconvene as a class, then quickly see what each room came up with and hopefully get you out of here a few minutes early tonight. Okay. So I'm go ahead and open up our rooms and then you are welcome to go to your assigned room.